A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was scrolling through some historical archives yesterday, and I realized how much of our modern conversation about the Middle East is built on these very polished, very simplified narratives that do not really hold up once you look at the legal plumbing of the past. Today's prompt from Daniel is about dhimmitude and the history of Jews in the Islamic world, and it is a perfect example of this. We often hear these two extremes. Either it was a golden age of interfaith harmony, or it was 1,000 years of unmitigated slaughter.
I am glad Daniel sent this because the reality is far more interesting and, frankly, far more structured than either of those caricatures. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been diving into the primary sources on this because you cannot understand the modern Jewish experience in the region without understanding the legal status of the dhimmi. The word dhimmi literally means protected person, but that protection came with a very specific, very rigid set of conditions that defined every aspect of life for over a millennium.
It sounds like a contract, right? Like a social contract where the terms are non-negotiable and you are born into it. Most people hear the word protected and they think of it in a modern sense, like a witness protection program or a protected class in labor law. But in the 7th and 8th centuries, protection was a much more lopsided deal.
It was essentially a treaty of submission. To understand why, we have to look at the theological framework. Since Islam was viewed as the final and superior revelation, those who followed earlier, superseded religions like Judaism and Christianity could be tolerated, but they could never be equal. They were allowed to live and practice their faith, but they had to acknowledge the supremacy of Islam in the public square. This was formalized in what historians call the Pact of Umar. While it is traditionally attributed to the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, in the mid-7th century, many scholars think it was a living document that evolved over time as the Islamic Empire expanded and needed a way to manage massive non-Muslim populations.
And the Pact of Umar is not just a polite suggestion. It is a list of very specific restrictions. I remember reading that it covered everything from how you dressed to how high you could build your house. What was the logic behind making someone build a shorter house?
The logic was visibility and hierarchy. A dhimmi's house could not be taller than the houses of Muslims. Their places of worship could not be taller than mosques. Even the sound of their bells or their prayers could not rise above the Islamic call to prayer. The goal was to ensure that the subordinate status of the non-Muslim was physically and orally apparent at all times. It was about maintaining a social order where everyone knew their place just by looking down a street. If you were a dhimmi, you were living in a world that was designed to remind you every single day that you were a guest on someone else's terms.
It feels very much like a pre-modern version of psychological signaling. You are allowed to exist, but you are never allowed to forget that you are a second-class citizen. And then there is the clothing. We often talk about the yellow badge in the context of 20th century Europe, but that actually has much older roots in the Islamic world, does it not?
It does. The Pact of Umar required dhimmis to wear distinct clothing to distinguish them from Muslims. This included the zunar, which was a special belt, and eventually, in various times and places, specific colors or patches. In 9th century Baghdad, for example, Caliph al-Mutawakkil mandated yellow patches for Jews. The idea was to prevent social blurring. If a Muslim met someone in the market, they needed to know immediately whether that person was a peer or a dhimmi, because that determined how you greeted them, how you traded with them, and what legal rights they had in that moment. You could not, for instance, give the traditional Islamic greeting to a dhimmi. There had to be a clear social distance.
So, if I am a Jewish merchant in Cairo in the year 1000, I am paying for this protection. That brings us to the Jizya. People talk about it as a simple tax, but it seems like it was more than just a line item in the budget.
The jizya is fascinating because it was a per capita tax levied on free adult non-Muslim males, but the way it was collected was often intentionally humiliating. There are accounts of the taxpayer having to stand while the collector sat, or even being struck on the neck as a symbolic gesture of submission. The Quranic verse that establishes the jizya, Surah 9 verse 29, mentions that it should be paid with willing submission and while feeling themselves subdued. It was a fiscal tool, sure, the Islamic State needed the revenue, but it was also a ritual of inferiority. It was the price of your life.
It is essentially a head tax for the right to keep your head, and in exchange, you are exempt from military service, right? That is often the defense I hear, that it was a fair trade because Jews did not have to go die in the Caliph's wars.
That is the common framing, but you have to look at what military exemption actually meant in a medieval context. It meant you were legally prohibited from carrying weapons. You were a disarmed population in a world where security was often a local, physical matter. You were entirely dependent on the goodwill and the competence of the Muslim ruler to protect you from mobs or nomadic raids. If the ruler was weak or the central authority collapsed, the Dhimmi was the first to suffer because they had no legal or physical means to defend themselves. It was not a choice to stay home, it was a forced vulnerability.
So the protection was only as good as the guy on the throne. If you get a caliph who is feeling particularly pious or particularly broke, the enforcement of these laws gets a lot tighter.
We see that fluctuation all the time. During the Umayyad and early Abbasid periods, things were relatively stable, and the laws were often applied with a degree of pragmatism. But then you look at the Almohad Caliphate in the 12th century in North Africa and Spain, and the situation becomes horrific. They gave Jews and Christians a choice: convert, leave, or die. This is where the Golden Age narrative really starts to fall apart. You cannot have a Golden Age if your existence is contingent on the whim of a single dynasty that can decide to revoke your protection at any moment. The Almohads destroyed the Jewish communities of Andalusia, forcing people like Maimonides to flee for their lives.
It is interesting you mention Spain because that is usually the poster child for this supposed utopia. But even there, you had the massacre in Granada in 1066, where a Jewish vizier, Joseph ibn Nagrela, was killed and the Jewish community was decimated. And the reason he was killed was essentially because he had become too powerful, which violated the core tenet of dhimmitude, that a non-Muslim should never have authority over a Muslim.
That is a crucial point. The Dhimmi system could tolerate a Jewish doctor or a Jewish merchant, but a Jewish political leader was a bridge too far for many. It created a glass ceiling that was reinforced with violence. The Granada massacre happened because Joseph ibn Nagrela was seen as being too arrogant, too visible, and too influential. It was a violent correction to return the Jews to their proper, subordinate place. What I find wild is how the Jewish community adapted to this. They developed an incredible degree of internal autonomy. Since they were excluded from the broader Islamic legal system in many ways, they ran their own courts and their own communal organizations.
This is where the Geonim come in, right? The heads of the academies in Babylon. They were essentially the supreme court for the Jewish world while living under the Abbasid Caliphate.
They were, and they operated in this weird middle ground. They were recognized by the Caliph as the representatives of the Jewish people, which gave them power, but that power was always subservient to the state. They managed everything from marriage and divorce to business disputes within the Jewish community. It led to the development of Judeo-Arabic, which we talked about in episode 1301. Jews were writing deep philosophy and legal codes in the language of the empire, but using the Hebrew alphabet. They were integrated into the culture but legally separated from the society. They were part of the world of Islam, but they were not of it.
It is a strange kind of parallel existence. You have someone like Maimonides, the Rambam, who is the court physician to Saladin. He is at the absolute peak of intellectual and professional influence, but he is still a dhimmi. He is still subject to these laws. How did someone like him navigate that?
Maimonides is the perfect case study. He fled the Almohad persecution in Spain and ended up in Egypt. In his writings, he is very clear-eyed about the hardships of living under Ishmael, as he called it. In his famous epistle to Yemen, he wrote about the humiliation and the heavy taxes, describing the Islamic rule as the most burdensome of all exiles. But he also used the stability of the Ayyubid Sultanate to produce his greatest works. He was a master of navigating the system, but he never mistook it for equality. He knew that his status was fragile. He was a physician to the Sultan, but he still had to pay the jizya. He still had to follow the rules of the Pact of Umar.
It makes me think about how we frame history today. There is this very loud narrative that tries to paint the pre-modern Middle East as this bastion of tolerance that was only ruined by modern nationalism or colonialism. But when you look at the actual legal framework of Dhimmi, it looks a lot more like institutionalized inequality than anything we would call tolerance today.
We have to be careful with the word tolerance. In the medieval world, tolerance meant I will not kill you today. It did not mean I think you are my equal or that you have the same rights as me. The Dhimmi system was often far better than what Jews faced in medieval Christendom, where expulsion and mass murder were much more frequent. In the Islamic world, the rules were at least consistent and legalistic. But being better than a massacre is a very low bar. We should not confuse the absence of genocide with the presence of justice.
And that is the nuance that usually gets lost. People want it to be either a paradise or a hellscape. The reality is that it was a highly regulated, often oppressive system that allowed for periods of cultural flourishing, but always kept the minority in a state of precarious submission. If you look at the history of Iran's Jews, which we covered in episode 13 and 14, you see how that played out over centuries of changing regimes, from the relative openness of some periods to the extreme persecution under the Safavids.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that this was a static law. People think the Pact of Umar was written once and stayed the same for 1300 years, but the enforcement was the variable. In some places, dhimmis could hold high office and live in luxury. In others, they were forced to live in mellahs, which were walled-off ghettos in Morocco, and were forbidden from riding horses because horses were considered noble animals reserved for Muslims. They had to ride donkeys, and even then they had to ride them side-saddle or dismount if a Muslim passed by. In some cities, Jews were even forced to walk barefoot or wear bells on their shoes so people could hear them coming.
That is a very specific kind of petty humiliation. It is not just about the big things, like taxes. It is about the daily interactions. It is about making sure that every time you leave your house, you are reminded that you are less than. And yet, despite all of this, Jewish life did not just survive, it thrived in many ways. Why was the Islamic world so much more successful at integrating Jewish talent than Europe was for a long time?
A lot of it was economic pragmatism. The Islamic empires were vast and connected. A Jewish merchant in Baghdad had cousins in Cordoba and business partners in Cairo. They spoke the same Judeo-Arabic, used the same legal codes for contracts, and could move capital across borders in a way that was very difficult for others. The caliphs realized that if they squeezed the dhimmis too hard, they would lose the very people who were keeping the wheels of international trade turning. It was a symbiotic relationship, but it was a parasite-host dynamic in some cases, where the host needed the parasite to function but still kept it under control. The state needed their taxes and their expertise, but it never wanted them to forget their place.
It is funny how often history comes down to the bottom line. But let us talk about the second-order effects. How did this system shape the way Jews saw themselves? If you are told for 50 generations that you are a dhimmi, that has to do something to the collective psyche.
It created a culture of extreme resilience and a very sharp focus on internal communal strength. When you cannot rely on the state for justice or protection, you rely on your community. It also led to a certain degree of political quietism. For centuries, the strategy was to keep your head down, pay your taxes, and avoid any action that might provoke the majority. This is one reason why the rise of Zionism in the 19th and 20th centuries was such a shock to the system in the Middle East. It was the dhimmi suddenly standing up and saying, "We are no longer interested in your protection. We are going to protect ourselves."
That is a powerful point. The transition from dhimmi status to sovereign statehood is not just a political shift, it is a total rejection of a 1,000-year-old social order. And you can see why that would be deeply threatening to a culture that had been built on the assumption of Jewish submission. It explains a lot of the vitriol we see today. It is not just about land, it is about the overturning of a hierarchy that was seen as divinely ordained.
And this is where the colonialist myth comes in, which we tackled in episode 1019. If you ignore the history of dhimmitude, you can pretend that Jews just showed up in the Middle East in 1948 as foreign invaders. But if you acknowledge dhimmitude, you realize that Jews have been an integral, albeit oppressed, part of that landscape for 1,300 years. They were the original inhabitants who were relegated to the margins by the Arab conquests. Reclaiming sovereignty is not colonialism, it is the end of dimitude. It is the transition from being a protected subject to being a self-determining citizen.
It is a decolonization of the mind, in a way, but let us look at the practical takeaways for someone listening to this. If you are reading about the history of the region, what are the red flags you should look for in how people describe this period?
The first red flag is the word harmony. If someone tells you that Jews and Muslims lived in perfect harmony before the 20th century, they are selling you a fairy tale. You should look for mentions of the legal status. Did the author mention the Jizya? Did they mention the Pact of Umar? If they are ignoring the legal framework, they are ignoring the reality of the lived experience. They are replacing history with nostalgia.
Another takeaway is to distinguish between tolerance and equality. You can be tolerated and still be treated poorly. I think a lot of modern secular people struggle with this because we take the idea of equal rights for granted. But in the medieval world, that concept did not exist. Everyone was part of a hierarchy. The question was just where you sat on the ladder. If you want to understand this period, you have to stop looking for modern values in an ancient legal code.
And the third takeaway is variance. History is not a monolith. Life for a Jew in Ottoman Izmir in the 1700s was very different from life for a Jew in Safavid Persia at the same time. The Ottoman Empire, especially after the Tanzimat reforms in the 19th century, actually tried to move away from dimitude toward a concept of Ottoman citizenship, though it was a messy and incomplete process. You have to look at the specific time and the specific ruler. The experience of a dhimmi in 10th century Baghdad was worlds away from a dhimmi in 18th century Yemen.
That Ottoman shift is interesting because it shows that even within an Islamic framework, there were attempts to modernize. But those attempts often faced massive backlash from the traditionalist segments of society, who saw the ending of dhimitude as a betrayal of Islamic law. It is a tension that is still very much alive in the region today, between those who want a modern secular state and those who want to return to a more traditional religious hierarchy.
It really is. And for listeners who want to go deeper, I highly recommend looking at the work of historians like Bernard Lewis or Mark Cohen. They have done the hard work of translating these primary sources. When you read the actual text of a jizya receipt or a decree from a local judge about how high a synagogue's roof can be, the history stops being an abstraction and starts being a very human, often very painful story. You begin to see the weight of those 1300 years.
It also makes you appreciate the radical nature of what we have now in the West, and in Israel, which is the idea of a citizen. A citizen is not a dhimmi. A citizen has rights that are not contingent on their religion or the whim of a ruler. That is a very recent and very fragile invention in the grand scheme of human history.
It is incredibly fragile. Most of human history has looked much more like dhimitude than like modern liberal democracy. We are the outliers, and I think that is why Daniel's prompt is so important. It grounds us in the reality of what the world looks like when you build a society on religious hierarchy rather than individual liberty. It reminds us that the default state of humanity is often one of structured inequality.
It is a sobering thought. Before we wrap this up, I want to touch on one more thing. How does this history inform the way we look at the Jewish communities that are still in the Islamic world today? There are very few left, but in places like Morocco or even Iran, they are still navigating these old echoes.
In many ways, they are still living in the shadow of dhimitude. Even where the laws have been formally abolished, the social expectations often remain. In Iran, for instance, the Jewish community is officially recognized and has a seat in parliament, but they have to be extremely careful to show absolute loyalty to the regime and to distance themselves from Zionism. It is a modern, high-stakes version of the old dhimmi contract. You can stay, you can even have a little bit of a voice, but you must never challenge the core ideology of the state. The protection is still conditional.
It is the same old deal, just with better technology and more cameras. Well, this has been a deep dive. I feel like we have barely scratched the surface, but that is the nature of 1,000 years of history.
It is, but I think we have hit the core of it. Dhimitude was not just a historical curiosity, it was a comprehensive system of social control that shaped the destiny of millions of people. Understanding it is the key to unlocking so much of what is happening in the world right now. It is the missing piece of the puzzle for anyone trying to understand the modern Middle East.
If you want to dig deeper into the specific regional stories, definitely check out episode 1314 on the Jews of Iran. It is a perfect companion to this discussion because it shows how these abstract laws we talked about today were actually enforced on the ground over centuries.
And if you are interested in the linguistic side of this, how the Jewish community created its own world within the Arabic-speaking world, episode 1301 on Jewish languages is the way to go. It is a great look at the cultural resilience we mentioned.
We should probably wrap it up there. Thanks to everyone for listening and for joining us on this historical deep dive.
And a big thanks to our producer Hilbert Flemingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
Also, huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We literally could not do this without them. This has been My Weird Prompts.
If you are enjoying the show, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify really helps us out. It is the best way to help other people find these deep dives.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and links to everything we talked about today.
See you in the next one.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird